Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave a proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free?
Our government was established in 1787 with the writing of our Constitution. The 13 British colonies that became the United States had all been incorporated as separate sovereign governments. After the Revolutionary War, it became essential that there be some form of central government to deal with common problems. But the central government was to be carefully regulated so that it would not overshadow the sovereignty of the colonies. The form of the central government was a federal republic, with the Constitution serving as its cornerstone. It was the supreme law of the land. That is, supreme in the sense that no law, neither national nor state, may be in conflict with it. The writers of the Constitution were fearful that the new central government might become too powerful. So they carefully made provisions to guarantee state sovereignty and individual rights by adopting the Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution contains words recorded to preserve its designer's intent. It is imperative for correct interpretation of the Constitution to know and to respect those original intentions. Tonight we are privileged to listen to Mrs. Jameson teach a high school senior government class on the subject of original intent.
All right, class, it's time to begin. Let's put those magazines away. Let's put our cell phones away. It's time to get started. How are y'all today? Doing okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Listen, guys, the lesson that we're going to study today is an extremely important lesson for your future. You know, when I was preparing for this study, I received this Time magazine. It's the July issue of Time magazine. And on it is our Constitution. Can you see that? And it's being shredded. And it says, does it still matter? Well, you know what, guys? I believe that it does still matter. And I believe that it's important for your future and for future generations that you understand that. Let's go ahead and open our books to page 393. Now, we've been studying the United States government and our Constitution for some time now, but today, what I'd like to do is go into a study on the original intent of our forefathers in writing our Constitution. Many believe that our nation is in great turmoil today, primarily because of the misinterpretation of the intent of our forefathers when they wrote this document. Our assignment in this study is to determine in our own minds if the government that we are now being governed under, is governing in a manner that was originally intended by our forefathers. We're going to do this by looking at the First Amendment. So look with me at the First Amendment. And it states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. Now, class, the intent of this amendment is simple and very straightforward. It states that Congress cannot make any laws concerning or relating to a religion or keep people from practicing their faith. The purpose of the First Amendment should be easily understood. It was added to protect citizens from government interference and the control of our freedom of religion, not to protect our government from the church or Christianity. Now, recently the phrase separation of church and state has been used to justify a complete reversal of religious freedoms and is now used to protect the government from the church. Even our Supreme Court has ruled that separation of church and state is a constitutional principle. Yet, it is not found anywhere in the context of our Constitution. This has led to an amazing number of judicial rulings that interfere with the original intent of our forefathers. Can anyone tell me what they think separation of church and state means? Lucas?
It means that we shouldn't pray at public gatherings, like football games or graduations, because that would be mixing the church with the state.
Okay. Based upon some of our laws today, Lucas, I can understand how you came up with that answer. But was that the true intent of our forefathers when they wrote this document? Is that what they really had in mind? Were our forefathers really so concerned that the church was so dangerous to the welfare of our nation that they would need to make laws limiting the free exercise of religion? I don't think so, especially when you consider that many of our forefathers, in fact, most of our forefathers, were deeply religious men. Let's just take a minute and look at the lives of some of these men. Ben Franklin, he was the senior statesman at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And at one point, when the debate became heated and it seemed as if the convention was just doomed for failure, he stood and he quieted the crowd. And he suggested that they begin each day with prayer, asking for God's guidance and wisdom. He was a man of deep faith. Listen to his words of wisdom spoken at the Constitutional Convention.
Mr. President, I have lived a long time, sir, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it.
Now, inspired by his understanding of Scripture and a strong faith in God, Samuel Adams worked to achieve three principal aims: attaining American independence, protecting people's constitutional liberties, and constructing an upright society.
The right to freedom being the gift of the Almighty. It is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave. These may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the Institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian Church, which are to be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament.
George Washington presided over the Constitutional Congress, and we know he was our first president. Let's read a portion of his speech at his first inaugural address. Emily, why don't you stand up and read that for us?
It would be peculiarly improper to omit, in this first official act, my fervent supplication to the Almighty Being, who rules over the universe, who presides in councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency.
Very good. Thank you, Emily. Now, as we study, class, I believe that you will see that our government's use of the phrase separation of church and state is in direct opposition to the First Amendment. For too long, we've allowed our government to shape our laws based upon what they think is best, rather than the truths expressed and recorded in our Constitution. For example, let's just look at the court decision reached in the case of Everson versus Board of Education. The courts announced, the First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. As a result of court cases, courts misinterpreting the original intent of the First Amendment, the courts began striking down religious activities and expressions which had been constitutional for over 150 years, while at the same time establishing numerous laws that prohibit the free exercise of religion. Let's take a look at some actual court decisions that have been made by our judiciary system that are flagrant violations of the intentions of our forefathers.
Ingel versus Vitale, 1962. A verbal prayer offered in a school is unconstitutional.
Reed versus Van Hooven, 1965. If a student prays over his lunch, it is unconstitutional for him to pray out loud.
Lowe versus City of Eugene, 1979. It is unconstitutional for a war memorial to be erected in the shape of a cross.
Foray versus Sioux Falls City School District, 1979. It is unconstitutional for a kindergarten class to ask who was born on Christmas.
Warsaw versus Tehachapi, 1990. It is unconstitutional for a public cemetery to have a planter in the shape of a cross. For if someone were to view that cross, it would cause emotional distress.
Harvey versus Cobb County, 1993. It is unconstitutional to display the Ten Commandments at a public courthouse.
Harris versus Joint School District, 1994. It is unconstitutional for a school graduation ceremony to contain an opening or closing prayer.
County of Allegheny versus the ACLU, 1989. It is unconstitutional for a nativity scene to be displayed in a public place.
Students, did you know that there is a scripture that states, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord"? Are we really ready to see God taken out of our nation? I'm not. We've been talking about how our religious freedoms have been infringed upon by a new and different interpretation of the original laws. But I just want to devote the next few minutes to include a study on the loss of state sovereignty as a consequence of our judicial system's misinterpretation of the original intent. Look with me in your books on page 397. We see this in the 14th Amendment. And as a result, it has increased the power and authority of the federal government by limiting the rights that sovereignly belong to the individual states. The 14th Amendment was written in 1868 to guarantee that freed slaves would enjoy all the privileges and rights of being a citizen of the state or of the nation. Part of this amendment states, read in your books with me, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and are not to be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, the 14th Amendment was a badly needed racial civil rights amendment to remedy the unjust treatment of slaves. But in the 1943 court case of Murdoch versus Pennsylvania, the courts declared that the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to limit the states, not just on racial civil rights issues, but on many issues in the Bill of Rights. This has extended the federal government's jurisdiction or authority over a state's sovereignty and their rights to make their own laws, and has reversed the historic position of the Bill of Rights. Let's listen to what Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, had to say about the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights was created because the people wished to see a line drawn as clearly as can be between the federal powers and the distinct sovereignty of the states. Without such distinction, there will be danger of a blurring of the Constitution, and gradually a consolidated government over all the people. The people of the United States live in different climates, are of different education and manners, and possess different habits and feelings. And under one consolidated government cannot remain free.
So, the Bill of Rights was to protect the people from the federal government exercising more authority over them than was necessary, right? And yet today we see the courts taking away those rights one by one.
Exactly. Now, class, you're beginning to see why it's so important that we understand the original intent of the writers of our Constitution. Students, you might remember the lesson that we have learned, that our government is divided into three branches. The executive branch, which is in charge of enforcing the law. The judicial branch, which is actually in charge of interpreting the law. And the legislative branch, which is in charge of making the laws. However, through the process of misinterpretation of the intent of its designers, our judiciary system has taken it upon itself to write new laws instead of simply interpreting laws passed by national and state legislation. Our forefathers created this division of responsibilities between the branches of government to keep and prevent this very thing from happening. Now, another misportrayal of the courts is concerning the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty ratified in 1786. Let's take a peek at the legislature of Virginia in 1776 and see what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had to say concerning Virginia's lack of religious liberty.
Virginia has a law that only legalizes the Church of England. And there are many who do not favor this law. There are Baptists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Quakers, and more who reside in this great state of Virginia. And I, Thomas Jefferson, propose that we vote to disestablish the Church of England as the only legal religion of Virginia and place all denominations on an equal footing. James Madison.
I propose that we begin making a law that will ensure religious liberty in the great state of Virginia.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Well, it sounds like what they were trying to accomplish by this statute was that other Christian faiths were to be acknowledged by the state of Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty was authored to ensure that different denominations would be able to have the freedom to worship God in the manner that they chose. As you can see, students, the intent of this statute was to secure the uninhibited expression for all Christian denominations and not to be limited to one government-approved denomination within the state of Virginia. You see, these guys had that back in England. They weren't ready for that here in America. They didn't want that. These great men recognized that one day there would be a possibility of government telling us when, where, and how we were to worship God. They were simply trying to make sure that this did not happen. But our current courts believe that Jefferson, Madison, and the Virginia legislature were attempting to limit Christianity and its public expression. Ironically, the courts use this very statute to limit Christianity and religious liberty and its public expression throughout the United States, when it was actually only a Virginia state statute. It had nothing to do with any other state.
Then how did we get to the place where our government is so adamant about not wanting us to pray in our schools or even having manger scenes on government properties? I mean, what had caused them to stray so far from the original intent, Ms. Jameson?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm going to tell you what I believe, Raymond. I believe that men's hearts have strayed so far from God. And I believe that most of the men who are in the political arena are there to promote their own agenda. You know, our forefathers got into politics because they wanted to bring glory to God. They wanted this nation to be a God-fearing nation. I want you to remember, class, I've said this before, but I want to say it again because I want to really drive the point home. The phrase separation of church and state cannot be found anywhere in our Constitution.
Wait, how can our government make laws to make sure that religion and the government stay separated if the phrase separation of church and state is found nowhere in the Constitution? Where did they come up with that phrase? I mean, you hear it all the time when they're making laws.
All right, well, let's look in our books. The phrase actually came from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in response to a letter from the Danbury Baptist Association sent to him in 1801. The Danbury Baptists were a religious minority in Connecticut, and they complained that in their state, their religious freedoms were not seen as inalienable rights, but as privileges granted by the legislature or as just simple favors granted.
What are inalienable rights again, exactly?
Okay, I'll do a refresher course on inalienable rights. Inalienable rights simply means that these are God-given rights that we have as citizens of the United States. that cannot be taken away from us. Now back to that letter. After Jefferson read that letter, he replied back to assure the Baptist that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights made it absolutely clear that there was a separation of church and state to protect the church from the state, not the state from the church. It was there in Jefferson's letter that the term separation of church and state was used to communicate the church's right to remain independent. Let's just look at some excerpts from these letters that were written.
Sir, our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty, that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, that no man ought to suffer in name, in person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill of his neighbors. But, sir, our constitution of government is not specific. Our ancient charter, together with the law made today in agreement, were adopted as the basis for our government at the time of our revolution. And such had been our laws and usages, and they still are, that religion is considered as the first object of legislation. And therefore, what religious privileges we enjoy as favors granted, and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men. May the Lord preserve you safe from every evil, and bring you at last to his heavenly kingdom through Jesus Christ, our glorious mediator. In behalf of the association, Nehemiah Dodge, Ephraim Robbins, and Stephen Nelson.
All right, so let's stop here and let me just explain. These men were writing to President Jefferson in the hopes that their state laws would acknowledge their inalienable rights to religious liberty, rather than just as simple religious favors granted. They wanted to ensure that their God-given rights to worship could not be changed or taken away from them. Now let's listen to the reply from President Jefferson.
Gentlemen, I'm believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes an account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. I reciprocate your kind prayers. Thomas Jefferson.
So students, you can see that the phrase separation of church and state that Thomas Jefferson wrote was simply meant to uphold the original intent of the First Amendment as a protector of religious freedom from government interference. Class, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were well planned based on specific political philosophies and decided on after extensive research, study, and debate. This fact was acknowledged at the Constitutional Convention by Benjamin Franklin. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I want to remind you, my fellow delegates, that we have gone back to ancient history for models of government, and we have examined the different forms of those republics, and we have viewed modern states all across Europe to prepare ourselves to write this Declaration and Constitution of the United States of America.
Now, as a result of the research and study of our forefathers in the writing of our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, our government is the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. As a matter of fact, there was a study done of about 15,000 political writings from the founding era. And this study showed that out of all the sources, the founders cited the Bible 4 times more than any other source.
They sure wouldn't be using the Bible today as a source, would they, Miss Jameson? If they did, we might not have so many crazy laws that restrict our rights.
Students, there's a new philosophy of law and government introduced by a man named Christopher Columbus Langdale. He was a dean at the Harvard School of Law. His new philosophy is called positivism. Let's just look in our book here on page 404 at some of the things that positivism represents. First of all, that there is no God-given standard of law, or if there are, they're irrelevant to the modern legal system. Second, God is not the author of law. Then the author of law must be man. Third, since man and society evolve, law must evolve as well. Fourth, judges guide the evolution of law. And fifth, to study the law, study the opinion of the justices rather than the Constitution. Class, our forefathers must be turning over in their graves.
Wow, this new philosophy of law and government really is far from the original intent of our forefathers.
And with this new measure of constitutionality being the opinion of the justices, why, standards now change just as quickly as our justices change. Here are just a few examples of the confusion that has resulted from this new philosophy.
Jones versus Clear Creek Independent School, 1992. It is constitutional for a student to have a non-secretary convocation at graduation.
Harris versus Joint School District, 1994. A student-led convocation at an assembly is a violation of the First Amendment.
Reed versus Van Hoven, 1965. Children are not mere creatures of the state.
Harris versus Joint School District, 1994. The courts for many years have held children are the wards of the state.
Bogan versus Dottie, 1979. It is constitutional to begin public meetings with invocations.
Lee versus Westman, 1992. It is unconstitutional to allow students to hear invocations in public meetings.
Marsh versus Chambers, 1983. It is constitutional for congressional chaplains to pray.
State Board of Education versus Board of Education, Netcong, 1970. Constitutional for students to read the prayers. It is unconstitutional for students to read the prayers prayed by congressional chaplains.
Well, Ms. Jameson, it sounds like here that one judge makes a ruling according to what he believes is right, and then another judge comes along and rules against the first one. It's right. So confusing.
That's right. You know, the departure from the original intent of the Constitution has brought about only confusion and contradiction, and now there are no genuine standards of law. Our founders established this government with a strong dependence upon religious principles and a clear limitation of federal powers. The crumbling of their ideas didn't happen overnight, and I don't believe that we're going to be able to change them overnight or with one single act. You guys are seniors, and you're getting ready to go out into the world. And you know, I want to challenge you to begin to get involved. I want you to really think about what can you do to make a change. And so I'm challenging you today to come up with some ideas of what you think you could do to help make a difference. Emily, why don't you stand up and give us some ideas?
Well, I think we need to understand the intent of our forefathers. Then we need to make sure that our understanding lines up with what they originally intended when they wrote the Constitution. We need to take a stand and act on the truth.
That's excellent, Emily. Lucas, you want to give us an idea?
It is important to judge new laws and base them on the original intent of our Constitution, and to make sure these new laws are a product of our forefathers' vision.
Okay, class, the bell's about to ring, but before it does, I want to read you two quotes. The first one is by William Penn, and he said, "Governments are made and moved by men. So by men they are ruined too. Let men be good, and the government cannot be bad." And then George Washington said at his inaugural address, "The favorable smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and what is right that heaven has ordained." Class, it's up to you. I want you to take this lesson to heart, and I want you to really think about it. Think about going out and making a difference in your world. Okay? There you go. Y'all have a good weekend.
We're at that point in the script where we're concluding our presentation, and the notation is that the pastor speaks. Last night, I literally tore out of this presentation what had been written for a concluding comment, threw it in the trash. And I said, this is a rare opportunity for me to really speak my piece. And I want to tell you what's in my heart. After the study that we put into this presentation, I am disturbed. I am upset. I pastor this church, and God and the freedom, the inalienable rights to the freedom of religion has been given to each of us, and I am upset. And I want to read to you something that's very strong, but it comes straight out of my heart. I wrote this on a yellow pad, and I had my wife get up and type what I had written. And this is what I had to say. Never before in the history of our country has there been a greater need to regain control of our nation than now. And I mean regain our control. This is a government of the people and by the people and for the people. That's us. We have been taught from childhood that we are the government and we elect representatives to represent us. We don't elect representatives because they're intelligent, they're educated, etc., and so on, so that they can make the decisions. They are to be our representatives and reflect our attitudes. Now, that requires some work on our part. And I'm quite frankly kind of ashamed to tell you that I've done not my fair share. Too busy with my own self-seeking interests to really devote part of my time to my country and holding responsible the elected officials of our government. It seems to me that the existence, listen to this, these are not just words. The existence of our country literally teeters in the balance of whether you and I are going to hold our government responsible for what we feel and what we believe. It teeters in the balance. The worst part of our dilemma is that our enemy is not outside the boundaries of our nation. It's not some country or some organization that's devoted to destroying the American way of life. It's within our own boundaries. Do you hear me? It's within our own boundaries. It's a diabolical thing. It's a secret thing. And it's slow and it's steady. With each tick of the clock, things are getting more and more askew in our government. Our judicial branch premeditatedly planned to change our constitutional-based philosophy into an evolving philosophy of law whereby the laws have no sound foundation but vary from judge to judge. We've heard that tonight. Our judges no longer look at the original intent of our forefathers but rule in court cases based on their opinions or on other case judgments based on not on the Constitution as the supreme law of the land, but laws made by men. I want to tell you what, there's no comparison between God and men. Absolutely none. Listen to what Thomas Jefferson wrote. Two things, two warnings. Number one, quote, "The Constitution is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please." And yet in another warning from Jefferson, with prophetic accuracy, Jefferson had this to say: "It has long, however, been my opinion, and I have never shrunk from expressing that the germ of dissolution of our federal government in the Constitution is in the federal judiciary." Our judiciary has gone absolutely zonkers. He goes on to say, working like gravity by day and night, gaining little today and little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief over the field of jurisdiction until all shall be usurped from you. Where are the constitutional checks and balances from our legislatures in our executive branch of government? Do we have eyes to see and ears to hear the fact that the judicial branch has become the new lawmakers? Do we realize they have absolutely usurped, gradually but surely, the ability to make laws? And where are our legislators? They too are to be held accountable. They have built-in checks and balances, but they have sat by passively as we have lost our freedom of religion. This is ridiculous. I mean, this is ridiculous. I stand here, I'm sitting here in my chair getting upset tonight. And we've practiced this. I've been through this. I'm telling you, this is diabolical. What they've done to the freedom of speech, to state sovereignty, and to the freedom of religion. I find this judicial conduct deplorable, unconstitutional, and un-American. I will not accuse these men of misinterpreting the Constitution. They're too intelligent for that. They are sharp people. They haven't misinterpreted the Constitution. That's a nice little term. They have intentionally and premeditatedly changed our supreme law of the land into something completely different from our forefathers' intentions in the writing of our Constitution. Anyone who would intentionally violate one or more of our constitutional rights or ignore the original intent of its writing is un-American and an enemy of our republic. Shame on our federal government and also on we the people allowing a travesty of this magnitude to occur. We the people are beginning to understand the fruit of our judicial mischief. There is a stirring of discontent among our fellow Americans that is unprecedented in my life. I've never seen anything like this. Everybody's upset. But everybody seems to suffer with what can I do? The solution to our frustration is to turn out in record numbers at the polls and elect representatives that will truly represent the vision of those who elected them. They are to take action to establish the Constitution and all the rights that have been usurped from us. That's the restoration we need in our country. With God's help we can, and I believe we'll bring the America envisioned by our forefathers with the Constitution, firmly adhering to the supreme law of the land. I got it said. I got it said. That's an exercise of my freedom of speech. But I'll tell you, we're going to have to shake off the cobwebs, folks. We're going to have to get involved. We're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to speak our hearts. Live our lives as a testimony to what we really believe is true and valuable. I will not sit by. I will not sit by and allow my rights to be usurped with some new philosophy, positivism.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the Texas prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. From the mountains to the Texas prairies, to the ocean
you, Lord.